I came home for Thanksgiving. The house was silent except for my husband's stepfather in the rocking chair. A note sat waiting on the counter. Derek's handwriting. Off to the islands with Brooke. You'll stay and care for Walter, he needs you. The stepfather opened one eye and asked, shall we? I said yes. It was quiet. Too quiet. No smell of turkey, no football on the TV. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the way Walter's eyes followed me like he already knew this was going to happen. I'd driven 5 hours with a trunk full of groceries and a heart that still believed my marriage, though strained, was worth showing up for. I believed we were spending Thanksgiving with family. That's what Derek said. Now I was standing in a cold, dim kitchen, reading the words that told me I had been discarded. Gone. Not for work. Not for family emergency. But for Brooke. And I was left behind with the man they called a burden. Walter. He didn't look like a burden to me. He looked calm. Tired, yes, but calm. Like someone who had been waiting for this moment. Someone who'd watched too long in silence and decided if no one else was going to do anything, maybe he would. I stood across from him, the note still trembling in my hand. They really left, I said, more to myself than him. Walter's gaze didn't shift. For days, he said flatly, they'll be back Monday. I nodded slowly. For days. For days to sit in this house and pretend I wasn't humiliated. For days to cook for a holiday that no one showed up for. For days to care for a man I barely knew but who, somehow, seemed to see me more clearly than my own husband ever had. Want some tea? I asked, reaching for the kettle. Walter gave a small smile. Only if we're going to need it. Walter's words hung in the air, but I didn't respond right away. Instead, I moved to the window, staring out at the frozen lake behind the cabin, the surface glassy and still. The silence wrapped around me like a weighted blanket. Cold. Heavy. I hadn't always felt this way, not when Derek and I first met. Back then, he was attentive, charming in a low-key kind of way. The kind of man who remembered how I took my coffee and encouraged my freelance design work even when I doubted myself. When we got married, he said it made sense for me to close my studio and work from home. It'll save rent, he reasoned. You'll have more time to take on clients. I believed him. Back then, I believed a lot of things. At first, it worked. But slowly, things shifted. My computer began having issues. He always forgot to call the technician. When I offered to replace it myself, he said it was too expensive. I started losing clients. Missing deadlines. Then came the suggestions. Maybe I should scale back. Maybe I should focus more on the house, on us. I told myself it was just a rough patch. That marriage was about compromise. But compromise started to feel a lot like erasure. He didn't like me going out with my friends. Claimed he just worried that it looked bad when I was out late with people he didn't know. He started checking my phone, looking over my shoulder, asking too many questions, delivered with a smile. I became smaller without even realizing it. Last year, when my dad passed away, he left me $30,000. I'd planned to use it to reopen my design studio, maybe even get a small office space again. Derek thought we should put it in our joint account for our future, he said. The future turned out to be Brooke and a Caribbean cruise. I didn't even realize how much of myself I'd given away until this moment standing in this house, surrounded by cold silence and a man I barely knew, and yet somehow understood. Walter cleared his throat, as if sensing the storm inside me. They made you feel useful, until you weren't, he said quietly. I turned toward him. How long have you known? He gave a slow shrug. About Brooke? A while. She's called here. Left messages. Derek always said she was just a coworker. But men like him don't lie well. At least, not to people who are used to watching. I sat down across from him. My hands rested on the table, limp. They took everything. Not just the money. They took time. Confidence. My trust. Walter nodded. They've been doing the same to me for years. First, it was little things, my pills running late. Then, they stopped buying proper groceries. Said it was to cut costs. And always smiling while doing it. I stared at him. They neglected you? He tapped the side of his temple. I may be old. I may be sick. But I'm not blind. His voice held no anger. Just truth. I thought back to all the holidays I had spent trying to impress Susan. The carefully chosen wine. The table settings. The Christmas when I made her lemon tart from scratch because she once mentioned it offhand. She never once thanked me. Not really. I remembered one Thanksgiving where Walter had coughed through dinner, and Susan simply said, "He's just being dramatic." And Derek had laughed. That moment came rushing back now with clarity I had ignored before. I had ignored a lot, because I wanted to believe that if I tried hard enough, I'd be accepted. Loved. Belonging was something I fought for so long, I didn't even notice I was bleeding out pieces of myself along the way. Walter stood slowly, walked over to the fridge, and opened it. Empty but for a half carton of milk and some stale bread. "I hope you brought groceries," he muttered. "I brought cranberries," I said bitterly. "And pie ingredients." He smiled. "Then we'll make pie." And, just like that, something small shifted. A shared quiet understanding passed between us. "I think," he said after a moment, "that we've both been underestimated." I looked at him, really looked. Beneath the cane and the hunched posture, there was still strength. A man who had spent a lifetime building something, only to be treated like an old appliance waiting to be hauled to the curb. We sat in silence for a while after that. The kind of silence that doesn't demand filling. Eventually, I pulled out my phone. I opened our banking app, though my hands trembled as I typed in the password. I had to see it for myself. $5,200. Gone. A withdrawal made 3 days ago. Our savings. The money for our future house. I showed the screen to Walter. He didn't look surprised. They did the same to me. Said it was for my care. Said they were helping. But the thermostat's been at 62 degrees for weeks, and I haven't had my prescription refilled on time since July. I shook my head. This isn't just selfish. It's calculated. He looked at me, then, his pale blue eyes sharper than ever. "Yes," he said. "And maybe it's time someone else started calculating too." I barely slept that night. Even wrapped in a heavy blanket in the guest bedroom, I couldn't shake the image of Brooke's arm looped through Derek's on that cruise ship deck. The caption still burned in my mind. "New beginnings. Caribbean getaway with Derek and family." Family. I had spent 5 years trying to earn that word, and he handed it to her like a party favor. By morning, something inside me had hardened. There was no message from Derek, no call from Susan. Just silence as if I didn't exist. But Walter existed. He was real, in pain, and being ignored. I couldn't fix the last 5 years, but I could start by making sure this man didn't feel as disposable as I now understood I had been. "I'm going to the store," I told him. "We're not eating stale bread and soup today." He raised an eyebrow. "Thanksgiving miracle?" "No. Just basic human decency," I muttered, grabbing my keys. At the grocery store, I moved on autopilot. Turkey breast. Potatoes. Green beans. A bottle of decent red wine. I didn't even care if it matched the meal, I just needed something warm. Something alive. When I returned, Walter had cleared the counters. He moved slower than I expected, but there was precision in his movements, like a man preparing for something important. "What's all this?" I asked, noticing a stack of folders on the table. "Evidence," he said, his voice low. "I've been documenting what they've done. Financial records. Neglect. Copies of prescriptions never filled. Notes about missed appointments. I didn't know what I was going to do with it all, until now." He pushed one folder toward me. Inside were photocopies of bank transfers, each one marked with a yellow sticky note. Derek and Susan had been siphoning small amounts from Walter's accounts, always just low enough to avoid notice, but over time, it added up to tens of thousands. And it wasn't just money. He had records of medication delays, missed doctor visits, a referral to a palliative care specialist that Susan had canceled with a note. "Too expensive. Not urgent." "This is elder abuse," I whispered. He nodded. "I know. But no one cares when the victim's old and the abuser's smiling." I swallowed the rising fury in my throat. "Why are you showing me this?" Walter's expression softened. "Because they betrayed you too. And because I don't have much time left." He pulled out a slim envelope and slid it across the table. "This is the real will. Not the version Susan thinks exists. This one was filed with my lawyer last week. Everything goes to you, Lauren, if you'll help me finish what they started." I blinked. "Why me?" "Because in 4 days, you've done more for me than they have in 4 years. And because you understand what it feels like to be discarded." A cold wave washed over me. "Walter, I don't know if I can." You can, he interrupted. And you must. I may be dying, but I'm not leaving quietly. Not after everything they took. There was a long pause between us. I looked down at my hands. For years, I'd waited for someone else to fix things, for Derek to become the man he once pretended to be, for Susan to welcome me in, for life to just adjust. But life didn't adjust. People like them didn't change. And people like Walter didn't come along twice. Finally, I nodded. Okay, what do we do first? That night, after our Thanksgiving dinner, simple but warm, we sat at the table with the folders spread between us. Walter pointed to one file. We start with the medical records. My diagnosis is terminal. Pancreatic cancer. They all know. They just don't care. I read the oncologist's report. Stage 4. Estimated survival, 3 months. I looked up at him, heart aching. I'm so sorry. He waved a hand. No pity. Just partnership. The phrase landed hard. He didn't need saving. He needed an ally. The next hour was filled with plans, calls to his attorney, ideas to document everything. He even had an old camcorder tucked away in the back of his closet. For testimony, he said simply. Before I went to bed, he stopped me in the hallway. One more thing, he said. They think they've left you with a burden. But what they actually left you is power. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint ticking of the old wall clock in the hallway. Walter's words echoed in my mind. They didn't leave you with a burden. They left you with power. Power. It was a word I hadn't associated with myself in years. Somewhere between compromise and survival, I'd lost it. Not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, piece by piece, through small concessions, ignored instincts, and too many second chances handed to people who only took. I turned toward the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting across the frozen lake like secrets too heavy to land. I'd always loved snow as a child. Now it just looked like silence. My thoughts spiraled. What if I helped Walter? What would that mean for me, for them? Was this justice, or just vengeance dressed in better clothes? Then I remembered Brooke's hand on Derek's arm, the way he hadn't even bothered to send a message, the money missing from our account. I remembered Susan laughing while Walter coughed through Thanksgiving dinner last year. This wasn't just betrayal. This was erasure. And I had let it happen for far too long. The next morning, Walter greeted me with a faint smile. His eyes were sunken, but sharp. Did you sleep? Some, I lied. He didn't press. Instead, he pushed a folder across the table. Let's begin. Inside was a plan, simple, precise. Not to destroy them. Not to humiliate. But to reveal. To let them see themselves clearly in a mirror of their own making. I agreed to help, but part of me was still afraid. Afraid of being too much. Afraid of being called cruel. Women are taught to swallow pain, to keep the peace, to choose quiet over righteous noise. But I wasn't afraid for long. Because by noon, I saw what Walter meant by power. Patricia Winters arrived in a gray sedan, sharp suit, sharper gaze. Walter's attorney for decades. She didn't blink when she saw me. Didn't ask if I was really okay or how long I'd known him. She simply nodded and said, "Let's get to work." Over tea, she walked me through the legal steps already taken: updated will, asset transfers, documentation of neglect. There's more, I said, pulling out the notes I'd started organizing. My background in design had taught me to think in layers: visual clarity, structure, narrative. She scanned a page, nodded approvingly. Perfect. You're a natural. I almost laughed. A natural at documenting a family's quiet cruelty. Patricia looked at Walter. We'll need final signatures and notarizations. I'll bring my notary tomorrow. Are you sure about the terms? Walter's voice didn't tremble. Yes. Lauren receives full control of the estate. Susan and Derek are to be disinherited, with full explanation cited as cause: abandonment, manipulation, and financial exploitation. And the charities? Patricia asked. Elder care foundations. 2 of them, Walter replied. 1 for housing, 1 for legal support. Nobody should have to prove they deserve dignity. I felt my throat tighten. That afternoon, I walked through the cabin alone, taking photos. The empty pill bottles. The thermostat showing 62 degrees. The near-empty fridge. Then I staged a few things, just as Walter had suggested. The hospital bed in the spare room. the folder of canceled prescriptions. His worn slippers placed carefully beside the bed like no one had touched them in days. "This is a story," he said. "And we're just arranging the facts so they can't be ignored." We worked side by side that evening, organizing files, reviewing witness names, neighbors who had seen Susan drive off when Walter could barely stand, bank tellers who'd watched Derek make odd withdrawals. I didn't realize how late it was until I caught my reflection in the darkened kitchen window. My hair was messy. My sweater stretched. I looked tired but different. There was something behind my eyes now. Resolve. I remembered something my father once told me. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. Derek had shown me 100 times. And I kept waiting for the next version to be better. That was my mistake. Walter caught me watching myself. "You're becoming very dangerous," he said with a grin. "Why's that?" "Because you stopped hoping they'll change. That's when the real healing begins." That night, I sat at the dining table long after Walter had gone to bed. I looked through the cruise photos Brooke had posted: champagne glasses, suntan smiles, Derek's hand on her waist. I opened a new folder on my laptop and labeled it Timeline of Absence. I began matching timestamps on social media posts with the growing list of documentation we'd compiled. Walter's pain medication left unfilled. His last scan. The week they shut off the heating to cut costs. And on the cover page I wrote, "They left him to die," and expected no one to notice. But I noticed. Around 2 a.m., I finally climbed into bed. Exhaustion pressed on my chest like a weight. But beneath it, clarity. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was building a record of truth. And when the time came, I'd hold it out to them, not to hurt, but to expose. So they could never say we didn't know. So they could never say it wasn't that bad. Because it was that bad. And someone had to say it out loud. By Friday morning, the trap was nearly set. Not a snare of deception, but of exposure. The kind that doesn't shout or accuse. The kind that waits, quietly, with the truth laid bare. Walter woke earlier than usual that day. His color was worse, his energy lower. But his mind? Still razor sharp. "We're close," he said, sipping weak tea. "Just a few more threads to tie." We spent the morning finalizing the files, dozens of pages of medical neglect, financial records, and handwritten logs from Walter. I scanned, organized, indexed. Each folder had its label. Each fact was sourced. At noon, Patricia returned, this time with Thomas, a solemn notary who carried a briefcase and a quiet respect for the dying. Walter sat upright in his chair like a man on trial who knew he'd already won. Signatures were added. Final documents sealed. Power of attorney transferred. The new will witnessed. Everything was official. "I wish I had more time," Walter said, pressing the pen into the table as though it held the last of his strength. Patricia touched his shoulder. "You've used what time you had better than most people use a lifetime." After they left, Walter turned to me. "Now we let them walk into the story we've prepared." The next day, I cleaned the house, not out of courtesy, but for presentation. I positioned the documentation in the dining room, folders stacked, tabs visible, a timeline printed and pinned on a corkboard. The video testimony we had recorded Walter speaking plainly to the camera about his illness, the neglect, the disappointment was loaded and cued on the living room TV. I placed a cream-colored envelope on the mantel, next to a photo of the entire family from 2 Christmases ago. In the picture, Walter stood slightly off to the side, half forgotten even then. "That's the one," Walter said quietly when he saw it. "Let them see what they never looked at." That afternoon, Melissa called. Derek's sister. The only one who'd bothered to check in. "Uncle Walter okay?" she asked. I sent her a photo. Walter pale in bed, medical equipment staged around him. "He's holding on, but not well," I texted. "If they want to say goodbye, it should be soon." An hour later, I received a message back. "They'll be home Monday. Non-refundable cruise." No mention of regret. No urgency. Just cost management. "They're still calculating," Walter said when I showed him. But so are we. On Sunday, we staged one final round of photos. Walter's oxygen mask on, his hand in mine, a thermometer nearby. Shadows cast just right to sync his features. Exhaustion etched into both our faces. I crafted one more message and left it on Derek's voicemail, my voice trembling but calm. "Walter's not doing well. The hospice nurse says his breathing's worse. Please call." Of course, he didn't. But the message was saved. Just like the last four. By Sunday night, Walter was fading for real. His cough had worsened. His appetite disappeared. "This isn't acting anymore," I said softly, adjusting his blanket. He gave a faint smile. "That's life for you. Always shows up uninvited." He asked for one thing that night, a glass of port wine he'd been saving for his 50th anniversary with his late wife. I found it in his study, covered in dust, but still sealed. We drank it together from mismatched glasses as the snow began falling again. "To clarity," he whispered. "To peace," I said. Walter passed just after midnight. No dramatics. No final words. Just a soft exhale and stillness. I held his hand long, after his fingers grew cold. For someone I'd known only days, he had given me more than most people ever had. He had seen me. Not as an obligation. Not as a wife failing to meet expectations. But as a person. Capable. Brave. Worthy. I made the necessary calls. Patricia arranged everything. The hospice nurse came, confirmed the time, offered condolences. Walter's body was taken with care and respect. The house was quiet again, but this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt ready. On Monday, I wore a simple black dress and sat in Walter's old rocking chair, facing the front door. The snow had stopped, but the sky remained heavy and gray. At noon, I heard tires crunching on the driveway. Voices. Laughter. The door opened. Derek stepped inside first, his arms full of duty-free bags, his tan a shade too artificial for November. Brooke was beside him, all white teeth and perfect hair. Susan followed, sunglasses still perched atop her head. They stopped short when they saw me. Derek blinked. "Lauren, where's Walter?" Susan asked, frowning. I stood slowly. "Walter passed on Saturday night," I said calmly. "The funeral was yesterday." It was beautiful. Their faces shifted shock, confusion, and for a brief second, something uglier. Inconvenience. "You held the funeral without us?" Susan snapped. "You weren't here," I replied. "And I left messages. You chose not to respond." Brooke took a step back. Melissa looked pale. Derek opened his mouth, closed it again. "There's a letter from Walter," I said, walking to the mantel. "He asked that I read it to you when you returned." I didn't have to shout. The silence pulled them forward. As I opened the envelope, they sat. The trap hadn't sprung. It was simply waiting for them to see it. I read Walter's letter with a steady voice. The words weren't angry. They didn't accuse. They simply revealed. He spoke of holidays spent alone while his family traveled. Of canceled medical appointments, of pain endured in silence. He spoke of Derek's disappearing calls, Susan's casual cruelty, Brooke's smirks during dinners when Walter was too ill to sit up straight. But it was the last part that silenced the room. I do not write this out of bitterness, but clarity. The greatest pain in life is not illness, nor even death, but the slow realization that those you love never truly saw you at all. When I folded the letter and placed it back into its envelope, the room stayed quiet. Even Derek had nothing clever to say. But we weren't finished. Walter recorded a statement, I added. "You may want to watch it." I pressed play. Walter's face appeared on the television gaunt, but composed, his voice calm. He told his story. Every detail. The withdrawals. The missed pills. The diluted medications. The empty fridge. The cold house. He ended with a single sentence that cracked something deep in my chest. "In Lauren, I found the kindness and courage my own family never gave me. I leave my legacy not to blood, but to honor." When the video ended, the silence turned brittle. Derek stood. "This is manipulative. You took advantage of a dying man." Patricia entered from the hallway, perfect timing. She and the notary had arrived minutes earlier and waited for the right moment. "I was Victor's Walter's legal counsel," she said, placing her briefcase on the dining table. Everything was filed according to law. His medical and mental competency were certified by 2 physicians. "This isn't manipulation. It's truth." Susan scoffed. "This won't stand in court." He was old, he was confused. Patricia didn't flinch. "You're welcome to contest the will. But I advise against it. The evidence of neglect is substantial. The documentation is airtight. And Walter's statement? Devastating." She turned to me. "Lauren, would you like to share the financial terms?" I nodded and opened a final folder. Walter's assets, estimated at $3.1 million, have been distributed according to his revised will. A large portion will be donated to elder care charities. I met Derek's eyes. The rest, including this house, now belongs to me. Susan's face went blank. The house is in the family name, she snapped. No, Patricia corrected. It's owned by one of Walter's holding companies. He transferred it last week. And Lauren is now the sole trustee. Derek's smugness vanished. You can't do this. I already did, I said. He stepped toward me, voice low. You're going to regret this. You'll be alone. Brooke. We'll bury you in court. I held out two things, my wedding ring and the keys to our old apartment. I regret marrying someone who sees loyalty as weakness. I regret giving you 5 years of my life. I placed the items in his open palm, but I don't regret walking away. I turned to Brooke. She looked down, avoiding my gaze. I said nothing. Some silences don't need to be filled. I left the house before the shouting started. I didn't stay to hear Derek argue with his mother, or Melissa cry, or Brooke pretend to care. I didn't wait for Patricia to serve the final paperwork or for the notary to hand them the disinheritance clause. None of it mattered anymore. Walter had given me everything I needed, not just security, but permission. Permission to choose myself. To stop apologizing for not being enough for people who never deserved me. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky heavy with snow again. I placed my suitcase in the trunk of my car and turned toward the house one last time. The rocking chair on the porch swayed gently in the wind. I thought of Walter there, wrapped in a blanket, sipping his port, listening to the wind roll across the lake. He had lived in silence for so long, and in the end, he'd let that silence speak for him. And for me. That evening, I checked into a quiet hotel outside town. Patricia had made the reservation. The room was small, clean, with a fireplace that flickered gently and a window overlooking pine trees covered in frost. I sat by the window with a cup of tea and opened Walter's final letter, the one he'd addressed to me alone. It was short. Lauren, I knew you'd come back stronger than you arrived. Whatever you choose to do next, do it for you. Live well. Live freely. That's the only justice that matters in the end. I folded the letter carefully, pressed it to my chest, and closed my eyes. Outside, snow began to fall again, silent and steady. But inside me, for the first time in years, it was quiet and warm.